Okay. And then what was it? When did you publish this, the dangers of fat metabolism and PUFA?
2016, that was
Okay.
that
So
one.
2 years, did you say 2013? So 3 years later?
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens between the 3 years? You're just getting more deep into the metabolic angle.
Yeah, I just got more into the Ray Peat thing, and I it was mostly so when you're doing a dissertation, a big part of it is the literature review in the beginning. And so at first I was like, okay, so the whole problem is PUFA, and I found all these papers about like the huge increase in PUFA intake over the 20th century that matches the obesity epidemic pretty well and stuff like that. And then I started finding these papers where high carb diets in the absence of fat. And I put this challenge out every time I give a talk for somebody to find a paper where either an animal or a human is given a high carb diet with low fat and it causes them to get fat because those don't exist. The only time, and what's really interesting is you find all these, because I was tuned in to looking at the methods and scrutinizing them because I found that a lot of people writing about high fat diets would say it's a high saturated fat diet, but the saturated fat content was less than the PUFA content, let alone the entire unsaturated content. So it's like very misleading to say, this is high in saturated fat. They're just, and or they would not even report the fatty acid content and then say, oh, this saturated fat in this diet caused this outcome in our study. It's like how, you know. So I was really tuned into that, and that was kind of my thing in grad school. Like with my dissertation, was having a big critique of the way people would report the diets they used in these experiments, or not report them, make misleading statements about like saying a nutrient that they didn't isolate caused something when you can't say that when it's not isolated. And then I started finding slowly the same thing with sugar, where they would say this is a high sugar diet, but it was also high in fat. So it'd be like, maybe 20% or less protein, maybe like 15 or something. And then it would be 50-50 for the rest of the calories would be carbs and fat. And most of those carbs would be sugar. And so for a mouse, 40% of their calories from fat is a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
That's I think a high fat diet is 45% of calories, and
mm-hmm.
40 is like moderate to high.
Uh-huh.
So, and yeah, and I could not find a study that kept fat calories low unless like do something like surgically lesion the animal, or a really powerful genetic deletion or modification that cause animals to get fat, or humans with a low fat, high carb diet, even if it's like fortified with tons of sugar.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you talking about like having to like special order chow or something. Wasn't it pretty difficult to find the correct food for your
Oh,
experiments?
yeah, I designed the diets with the Research Diets company, the
Mm-hmm,
one, it's like the biggest supplier,
mm-hmm,
and they got kind of some notoriety when Chris Masterjohn wrote something about, because they had been measuring the types of fats in the ingredients that they get,
mm-hmm,
found that the lard they were using was like had twice as much PUFA as they had been labeling.
mm-hmm.
And they put out something about that, and he picked up on that and wrote about it and said, and that's a another whole problem, is even beyond the scientists that were using their products, and then pretty much every other company copies Research Diet's main two products, their kind of control diet and the high fat diet. So everybody that was using those, not only were these people doing kind of a bad job reporting what was in the diets and making connections that didn't make sense and being a little misleading, but they themselves were getting artificially low PUFA and artificially high saturated, and I think oleic monounsaturated percentages for the diets if they even reported them correctly. So it was this like field wide. Of course, nobody in the field like acknowledged it or cared about it, but it was like a thing where all of these papers saying, "Oh, saturated fat caused this," are now whatever the percentage that they said the diet was, it was lower, much higher in unsaturated fat.
So you're noticing all these incongruencies, and also your own experiment that you had performed with the PUFA. So those, as you had mentioned before, kind of shift you in a direction. Ultimately, writing this paper.
Yeah, it was mostly that what clicked for me was it seemed like we're living through a repeat of the moment when stuff like Pritikin and others had planted the seeds, which, because there wasn't social media, the internet back then, they grew a lot more slowly. But the idea that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, and eventually that they cause kind of everything bad, like obesity and whatever, that we were living through a similar moment with sugar, and that the scientists and the commentary and everything was making the same fundamental, maybe not exactly the same because it's different, but the same genre of mistakes to get there. And so I was like, well, okay, I'm going to go to these things, and I knew that nobody was going to like it, and I knew that like not one person on a paleo diet or a low or zero carb diet was going to change their diet because I said this, but I just almost wanted, like, for the historical record, like, let the record show that there was a guy in 2016 and 2017 at these paleo, and it ostensibly it's like ancestral health symposium, but those, like, the paleo has been pretty monopolized by the low carb faction.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So you know and so I just wanted there to be a record of somebody saying, like, this uh, anti-sugar, anti-carb in general, but specifically anti-sugar, anti-fructose thing doesn't have a good foundation, and it seems like at some point it's going to have to go through the process of becoming a fad, becoming mainstream, becoming dogma, and then it'll start to revise itself and fall back, and by that'll be like 20 years from now or something. But yeah, I just wanted to shout that.